they didn't, when the Americans first went in, they had no idea what the tribes were in Iraq. They gradually anchored the Dulaim and Al-Anbar in places like Fallujah. And, you know, they didn't ask me about this, but I would have told them, you really shouldn't mess with the Dulaim. That's a picture of where these guys are. So Dulaim is out west. Fallujah and Ramadi, those are Dulaim areas. And Jubur is up north, and so forth. So this is part of the political landscape. But, as I said, only about a third of Iraqis are rural or identify so much with a tribal identity. Most of the urban people, and there's been enormous urbanization in Iraq in the last 60 years because of oil. Oil brings in money, and there's money to construct buildings and invest, and make pharmaceutical companies and all kinds of factories and so forth. So the oil money was an engine of urbanization in the past 60 years. And people who settled in the cities, you know, you get cut off from your cousins, and kinship becomes less, kinship politics becomes less important. And they were very attracted as they built new national identities and new political identities. They were very attracted by Arab nationalism. And Arab nationalism has many forms, but it's a kind of idea that all the Arabic speakers should be ultimately in a single state or a coalition of states, kind of the United States of Arabia. It's, in my view, kind of a crackpot theory because they just speak Arabic. There are 2,000 dialects of Arabic, and they can't even, you know, understand each other necessarily. No offense to the Moroccans. We believe you are speaking Arabic. We can't understand you. From the point of view of the Eastern dialects, there are outliers. But they have this idea that all the Arabs should be in one state, and for Sunni Arabs in Iraq, that was a way of, you know, identifying with Egypt, the great populous Arab country, which was more powerful and nationalist. And so they became attracted to the Ba'ath Party. As they urbanized, it gave them a framework. And the Ba'ath Party was a combination of socialism, one-party politics, and ethnic nationalism. So it was like communism in a way, but the communists wouldn't approve of it because in communism you're not supposed to bring up about ethnicity. It's all about, it doesn't matter what ethnic group the workers are from, they should all just be united together. Whereas the Ba'ath Party took some emphases from communism and socialism, but it also talked about forming the new Arab person, al-insan al-arabi al-jadid. And so it was a kind of ethnicized leftism, and it had some advantages for Iraq. It generally was a horrible thing, but it had some advantages for Iraq. One was that it didn't matter whether you were Shiite or Sunni or Christian or Jewish, and if you identified Arab, and there were, you know, before the rise of Israel and even somewhat after, there were Jews living in the Arab world who identified Arab. And Iraq had a big community like that, which gradually was destroyed, dissipated, and went elsewhere. But anyway, for the ones that remain, the Christians and the Sunnis and the Shiites, and they have other things in Iraq. Iraq is very complicated with regard to religious ethnicity. The Ba'ath Party had certain advantages. So the Turkmen, who speak Turkic, they, surprisingly enough, they were very attracted by the Ba'ath Party, the Sunni Turkmen, and they, you know, because the price of admission was that you learned Arabic, and most people in Iraq did. The Kurds, not so much. The Kurds never liked Ba'athist ideology because they didn't identify Arab. So a lot of Sunnis joined the Ba'ath Party. It was very popular amongst them, but also Shiites did, and it's been estimated that half of the Ba'ath Party functionaries, the lower level Ba'ath Party functionaries in Iraq in the 1980s, say, were were Shiite. But the upper echelons of the party and of the Iraqi military were, disproportionately Sunni Arab. I don't think the Sunni Arabs in Iraq are more than about 17% of the population. Because you have Kurds, you have Shiites, 60% are Shiite, probably 22% are Kurds. So, but they, the high generals and the Revolutionary Command Council and so forth, they tended to be Sunni. And the Ba'ath had come to power in 1968 and ruled Iraq. And it did, it industrialized the country further, it spread education, it was a horrible one-party state which murdered a lot of people for being dissidents. But these horrible one-party states also did do, development work, basically. But by the 1990s, it was all in decline, and the United States and the UN had put very severe sanctions on Iraq, and it wasn't doing well. And then the Bush administration, for reasons that are still somewhat unclear, decided to invade and occupy Iraq. I actually did some consulting at some point because Washington figured out that I had written about Iraqi history, and they called me. The Congress, one time a set of congressmen, the senators and congressmen, I was consulting with them. And I swear to God, one of them, a Republican, sidled over to me and said, "Why do you think we're there?" I nearly fell off my chair. I said, "I'm a Midwestern college professor. You're a congressman. You're asking me why we're there?" I don't know. So we'll find out eventually, I guess. One of the things they did when they invaded and occupied Iraq was to overthrow the Ba'ath Party, and they brought allies with them, the Americans, which were expatriate Iraqis, predominantly Shiites, some Kurds, who were their allies, and they installed them in power. You had the Coalition Provisional Authority was the American government of Iraq in 2003, 2004, which, by the way, never had a congressional charter. It never existed in the law. It doesn't seem to have kept receipts either. People ask me, well, where did the $12 billion go? And I would say get a shovel, wander around nice houses in Fairfax County, Virginia, and dig in the backyard. But it locally, it was very incompetent. It was called Can't Provide Anything, CPA, Coalition Provisional Authority. Well, and that was the American government. Then below that, they established a transitional Iraqi government, which was transitional government, they made predominantly Shiite. They brought in members of the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, which had been founded by Ayatollah Khomeini among Iraqi expatriates in Tehran. So it was very strange to have these guys, Ayatollahs sitting on this council governing Iraq alongside Paul Bremer, who was the former ambassador to the Netherlands. The Shiites in Iraq were quite frankly vindictive. And if you compare post-war Iraq to South Africa, it's quite instructive, because when the African National Congress, which had been a communist organization, took over South Africa, they had grievances. The Afrikaner state, the apartheid state, was mean, killed people, large numbers of people, and arrested them arbitrarily and tortured them. Wasn't a nice government. You meet Afrikaners, many of them are perfectly nice people. I'm not saying anything about that. We're all fans of Charlize Theron, but that government was horrible. And when the African National Congress took over South Africa, they could have been vindictive. They could have driven white South Africans out of their homes the way Mugabe did in Zimbabwe and so forth, but they didn't. They did kind of insist on being included as junior partners in many of the Afrikaner corporations. If you look at the former communists of the ANC, many of them have the infinities and so forth now. But they came up in the world, but there was a matter of sharing, and then their commission of inquiry of apartheid government didn't actually take people out and shoot them for war crimes. They made a deal They said, if you will confess your war crimes, you'll be, you know, the skunk at the party. You won't be able to participate in public life and so forth, but nothing bad will happen to you. And so they went through all of these officers and policemen and politicians and got them to admit the horrible things they had done to the black Africans. But then after that, they left them alone. They kind of, there was reputational damage. You don't usually invite your war criminal to dinner. But the Iraqis did it backwards. They did it all the other way around. So the Shiites who came with the Americans, the expatriates like Ahmad Chalabi and so forth, they set up what they called a de-Baathification committee to de-Baathify Iraqi society, to punish people for having been a member of the Baath Party, which they coded as a kind of Nazi party. And you know, if you were a high school teacher in Iraq in 1992, and you wanted to go to a summer school on Shakespeare in London, well, you would need a passport. How would you get the passport? Had to be a member of the Baath Party. So you might join. Now, the Bremer and his Shiite colleagues are coming to you and saying, you're a Nazi, you're fired because you joined the Baath Party. They fired something on the order of 70 to 100,000 people for having been members of the Baath Party. Not all of them high up, and not all of them having been proved to have done anything particularly bad. And then they brought in Shiites to replace them, their cousins and so forth. This firing of people was made even worse because the economy had collapsed. There were no jobs. There was no, you know, Iraq was a socialist country, so it was a huge public sector. There wasn't much of a private sector. So once you got fired from your government job, it's not like you could go out and get another job very easily. And then the U.S. also wanted to spread the free market in socialist countries, so it just let the state-owned factories and things collapse. The magic hand was supposed to substitute. And you know, I admire entrepreneurs. I think that entrepreneurialism is hard work and it requires a lot of training. And the Iraqis didn't have that. There wasn't any magic hand. And so it was unrealistic to expect that to happen. So enormous unemployment swept through these Sunni Arab areas. Ramadi, Fallujah, Mosul. People who used to be on top of society, had the really good jobs, all of a sudden they're on the bottom. And the message to them is, the Shiites and the Kurds are now in control along with the Americans, and you used to be an elite, but you're not anymore, and you're unemployed, and maybe we'll let you be janitor. And yes, we'll have elections, and if you want, you can have members of parliament, but it's one chamber, there's no Connecticut compromise, and you will be overruled by every vote from here to eternity because you will be a minority in parliament. Well, the Sunni Arabs, as we mentioned, you know, were an elite, and there were poor people amongst them, but there were a lot of elite people as well. They were the equivalent of the West Point graduates in this country, and the Harvard MBAs, and the Pentagon Chiefs of Staff, and they weren't going to take this line down. And you know, they gave the Americans a little bit of space to see, well, what's going to happen? Are they going to do something good for us or bad? And once they figured out that they were going to be royally screwed over by the Americans and their allies, they decided to revolt. So they formed cells, and they started blowing up things. They set improvised explosive devices along the side of the street where they knew that American jeeps were coming. They blew up a Shiite Ayatollah. And you know, there were maybe 50 major cells. I mean, with each with hundreds or thousands of members all over the country, predominantly in the West and North, where the Sunni Arabs were. And many of them were secular-minded. So there was the 1920 Revolutionary Brigades. That's an echo of the 1920 revolt against the British in colonial times. Those were relatively secular Sunni Arabs. One secular group called itself, very confusingly, the Army of Islam. But they didn't pray regularly. Many of them were neo-Baathist. I mean, the Baath Party had been dissolved and abolished, but people had grown up in its framework, and so they still thought of themselves as Arab nationalists and secularists and so forth. And often these were led by former Iraqi army officers, and this is true to this day. Those now would be the younger officers, but they're still active. And one of the things we saw as time went on, however, was that some Sunni Arabs, not a majority, but some of them turned away from secular Arab nationalism as their political identity and increasingly turned essentially to Al-Qaeda. And by the way, I predicted this in 2002. I said, if you invade Iraq and overthrow the Ba'ath Party, you will delegitimize secular Arab nationalism, and where will people go? Right into the arms of Al-Qaeda. So, unfortunately, my talk at the International Institute at the University of Michigan was apparently not widely read in Washington, but it was obvious that this would happen. And one of the people who organized those Sunni Arabs who felt so grieved that they gave up their former political identity and started moving towards a kind of Sunni Arab radicalism was Abu Musab Zarqawi, a Jordanian. He had been briefly in Afghanistan. And he was originally not close. In fact, he had a feud with bin Laden. However, he came back to Iraq before the American invasion. He actually was cited by the Americans as a reason to invade Iraq. The fact that Zarqawi was in Iraq, because he was, I don't know why. He was coded as Al-Qaeda, but he didn't like bin Laden and wouldn't let his people give money to Al-Qaeda for fundraising. But somehow Zarqawi had been in Afghanistan. I don't know, he knew bin Laden. That was why we had to invade Iraq. And then Colin Powell and Dick Cheney and these guys all told this story that Saddam liked Zarqawi, and the Zarqawi was wounded at one point, was taken to hospital in Baghdad, and I don't know, the nurses came in and fed him grapes and treated him royally and so forth. So that's why we have to invade Iraq. But I found, after the invasion, they released a lot of the Ba'athi documents. I found this document, which was an all-points bulletin from the secret police, that there's this very dangerous man in Iraq named Zarqawi who had been in Afghanistan with bin Laden, and he should be found immediately and arrested and shake down the Jordanian community wherever it is, because he might be known to them, to find him and get rid of him. This was from the summer of 2002. So all of that fairy story, which you can go back and find in LexisNexis about Saddam and Zarqawi, is complete fabrication. Of course, that was very rare. In this particular war. And they were called, the kind of people around Zarqawi were called Salafi jihadis. Salafi was a movement of Sunni Islam in the late 19th century and into the 20th that said that we've become sclerotic, that we have too many medieval glosses on the Quran, and who cares what medieval people thought the Quran meant. We should go back to the time of the companions of the Prophet themselves. See what they said about Islam, the first generation. So it's a little bit like Catholic reformism, putting a new emphasis on the patristics and going back beyond, the medieval commentaries. And however, and most of them were liberals. Some of the early Salafis corresponded with Tolstoy and learned French and studied science and so forth. But over time, in the mid-20th century, the Salafis were captured by, in many instances, they became very influenced by the Salafi form of Islam, the Wahhabi form, which is, frankly, on the whole, by and large, somewhat anti-intellectual, very, I don't know what to call it, because, the reporters say it's strict Islam, but strict implies that that's the way you ought to do it. And nobody thinks that outside of Saudi Arabia. So it's a particular sectarian, rigid form of Islamic law, but it became influential among some of the Salafi Sunnis. And then over time, there were some Salafis who were radicals and who said, we have to, not only do we have to live a Puritan kind of Muslim life, but the fact that we're ruled by all of these impious people is unacceptable. We have to start blowing things up. So you have